Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome back to the Conversations with the Archbishop after the winter recess. It's good to be gathered here on this fine spring Melbourne morning. As we begin this morning, we acknowledge the original custodians of this land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and their elders past and present, and we honour them and any Indigenous people who are with us this morning. My name is Chris Lancaster and I'm the Vicar of the Anglican Parish of Altona and Laverton, and it's my privilege to be your MC this morning as we meet for this conversation on the topic of the challenges that are facing young Australians. And talking about that topic with the Archbishop this morning are Fatima Measham and Benson Saulo. Let me tell you a little bit more about each of these two remarkable people. Fatima Measham is a writer with a focus on social justice, politics and diversity. She's a consulting editor and columnist at Eureka Street, and her work has also appeared in various publications including the ABC Religion and Ethics website, The Guardian, The Big Issue and Measham. And she's a former secondary school teacher currently living in the outer western suburbs of Melbourne. Benson Saulo is a descendant of the Wemba Wemba and the Jawajali Aboriginal nations of Western Victoria and the New Ireland province of Papua New Guinea. He grew up in Tamworth in regional New South Wales and began a career at the ANZ Bank at the age of 15. In 2011, Benson was appointed the Australian Youth Representative to the United Nations, and in this role he undertook a national engagement tour in which he engaged with over 27,000 people, both face-to-face and online, and then represented Australian youth at the 66th session of the United Nations General Assembly. And in 2012 he became the founding director of the National Indigenous Youth Leadership Academy, which engages young Indigenous people to lead positive change in communities across Australia through youth-led social action initiatives. So would you please welcome Fatima Measham and Benson Saulo.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome to Fatima and Benson. I think just to start, they're probably, and it's an awful thing, isn't it, to be in a position of almost being the representative younger person to speak about others. So we know your opinions are your opinions rather than necessarily everyone else's. But what do you think is Fatima, I suppose the defining issue of generation of people under 30 in Australia today? What are the kind of things that really are defining who they are?
I should probably put a bit of disclosure. I'm just on the cusp of no longer being considered youth. But I do have a 7-year-old son, and I teach a couple of tutorials at university, and I was a former secondary teacher, so I bring all those dimensions together, to this forum. In terms of a single defining issue, it's really hard to pin that down because there are so many challenges. But I think overall, I was really struck by how much uncertainty young Australians face today, and from different sorts of fronts. There's uncertainty around housing security. There's uncertainty around climate change. There's uncertainty around. We know the Australian economy at the moment is a bit weak. There are some issues that are yet to be addressed. There's uncertainty around employment as well. So I think that's, to me, captures really what young Australians are facing today, what my son will be facing in the future as well.
We might come back and explore some of those individual points in a bit of detail. But Benson, what's your take on the kind of the thing that defines the experience of people under 30?
Yeah, I think it also comes to situational places in which young people are living and existing and working. And what I'm seeing with the work that I've been doing over the last few years is around mental health. We're seeing a lot of young people that are identifying with high levels of anxiety and depression. We're seeing that the #1 killer of men under the age of 25 is suicide. There's something that's, I think, critically wrong in today's society where there's a disconnect at a very social and kind of person-to-person, human-to-human kind of relationship It's slowly being fractured, and there's issues around cyberbullying, and which is drastically impacting our young people and our young students, and then also the things that Fatima mentioned as well. So things around affordability. So when young people, so I'm 27. I'm in the stage of life where I want to consider looking at a house, but right now I'm going to have to move back to Tamworth. And I like Melbourne, and because it's actually unrealistic for my generation, which is the generation that's taken on the most debt in the last few years, in the last 10 years, to actually consider, unless very fortunate to be sitting on assets or to have a certain amount of inheritance that's coming our way. But not being in that situation, it's very unrealistic for a lot of my generation and myself to even consider owning a home. And so that idea of an Australian dream of owning your own home with the hills hoist out the back, unfortunately that's something that was lost in previous generations or the generations before them.
Well, let's just explore perhaps one of those, some of those themes around uncertainty, because I think they probably can feed in a bit together. But this whole situation of the uncertainty of, say, housing security for young people, the increasing number of young people who are under housing stress and for whom homelessness seems to be, the outcome of that. What's the kind of the remedies that you can see that as a society we could put in to help that be a different outcome?
That's a really complex. I think that's really complicated, and there isn't. I mean, I don't want to go about it in a sort of silo approach of if you fix one bit, then everything else gets fixed. Like, it doesn't work like that. A lot of it has to do with the health of the economy, whether there are jobs, the access to jobs, access to mental health services, housing assistance. These structures are actually already in place. And I think it's a case of, I think the problems that more and more people will be needing access to those services, I imagine. So I'm not sure that there's a panacea necessarily for addressing, if you're talking about housing insecurity. I suppose like house prices have gone through the roof, so that kind of pushes back. We were talking about access. I saw the other day that the age in which people become first-time homeowners is getting later and later. So I'm not really sure what we can do about house prices. There are market forces at work, and there's issues around supply and demand. I'm not sure, you might be able to speak to this more, Benson.
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of discussion around the possibility of negative gearing and being able to, if we were a homeowner, to be able to purchase other properties and being able to provide spaces for rent. And the issue that I have with the area around home ownership is that in order to own a home, you obviously have to be able to afford that first deposit, which is from $30,000 upwards to $60,000, depending on where you're living. And then there's also the other the stresses around actually employment. So how are you actually being able to afford the asset that you're taking on? And so we actually need to look at the current workforce that young people are moving into. Is the workforce reflective of the skills that they're learning in the schools? No, not at all. The workforce that we're training our young people up currently is actually 10 years ago. Actually 10 years is still in the 2000s. So we're actually looking back at the 1990s, like 1985, and unfortunately, the governments of the successive governments over the last few years have not been responsive enough to the needs of young people that are moving into the workforce to hopefully earn their, if they're wanting to become homeowners to start off with, to earn their deposit, to be able to move into worthwhile work that not only is fulfilling for themselves, but is contributing to society, that is also enabling them to have some kind of financial security. And before we even look at I guess, affordable housing. And yes, yeah, like you said, you can't look at one issue and then kind of ignore the others. There needs to be a multi-pronged attack. Well, that's very vicious this early in the morning. Sorry. We'll start that at 9 o'clock. That starts up the road a bit. But we need to have a multifaceted approach, and one way, and where we need a place that we need to consider starting is within the schools, our education system, as well as how we're looking at policies that enable young people to enter in the home ownership market.
Can I just jump on jobs and employment? I think the business editor, Ian Verender, at The Drum, cited a survey where a third of recent graduates were still unemployed 6 months after graduation. So there is sort of this gap. I'm not sure whether at this point that's a concern, but if a third of graduates are finding it difficult to find full-time jobs or the jobs that they want 6 months out from graduating, then that's a lot of, that can be quite stressful. And we got to ask ourselves, why does this gap exist? But the other part of the employment picture is that it's a casualised workforce. I think young people have always been a huge part of the casualised workforce, but a lot of the jobs that are out there seem to be contract-based as well, so it's very contract-driven. So if you look at trying to get a home loan, for example, being on a 3-month, 6-month contract, doesn't really make you a very ideal, doesn't, as far as the bank's concerned, doesn't make you an ideal candidate for a mortgage. So these things link together. So if you've got like workforce conditions, for example, that are casual and that are contract-driven, so from an employment point of view, that's not a very stable, way to go. But at the same time, it also keeps you from accessing things like mortgages. So this goes back to the uncertainty and insecurity.
So what do you think is the impact? We've touched two things really there, about housing instability, the uncertainty of employment. What's the impact on identity for people you speak to in being in that situation?
So I've been fortunate to travel right across Australia and meet with young people, and also currently running workshops with an organisation that I set up with a mate or two mates called the Man Cave, which actually works with young boys around mental health issues and deconstructing masculinity. And what we're constantly, I should say, coming up against is just this level of anxiety around, well, once I step outside of these school doors, what is the uncertainty that awaits me? And when we're seeing, when I think about jobs, sorry, I'm just going to park that for a second, I'll come back to it. But when I think about jobs, there's three key issues that, not necessarily issues, but factors or influences that are changing the way that we think about work. And there's the element of globalization, which is inevitable, which is happening. The issue around automation. So a lot of the service jobs and admin jobs, a lot of the part-time jobs that young people take up when they're still in high school, these things are all being turned into automation. So think about when you're going to your local Safeway or wherever you go to shop, and then you have the computer checkout or the person checkout. I choose the person checkout because, unfortunately, every time that there's one of those computer checkouts, unfortunately that means there's 4 jobs that have just been lost. And so we need to really think about the impacts, the negative impacts of automation, but there's also some positive impacts. There is a lot of positive impacts of automation as well. And then thirdly is the collaboration, and this is the piece that you're referring to, is that there's a lot of contract work where you're kind of jumping between, but there's also a lot of opportunities online to be able to bring communities together to actually to work together for a particular outcome or a particular job. And that's the changing faces of employment in the next few years.
That's right. It's actually more nuanced because, like, we can talk about youth, the rates of youth unemployment, but participation's actually not bad. I can't recall the actual figures, but young people are either going back to education or staying in education. So if they're actively looking for work. So what I'm saying is, even though there might be significant numbers of unemployed, the participation rate is actually high. So these are young people who are actively looking for work, are in education, or going back, returning to education. So in terms of identity, I think young people are actually really agile. I think that's true for every generation anyway, so I don't want to go, oh, this Generation Y or whatever. So they're actually pretty agile, and I'm just trying to recall, I think Greg Jericho looked at the statistics around that, and some of the sentiments from young people. A lot of young people are actually choosing some of these contract work. So, a lot of people are actually freelancing, and that some of that is actually by choice. They like the flexibility, and they like being able to determine their own hours and to actually go for jobs or projects that interest them, that appeal to their interests and passions. So I think there are nuances here, I think. So it might be the case that attitudes to what work is about are changing as well, and maybe the workplace hasn't caught up to that yet, or our economic structures haven't caught up to that yet.
Yeah.
So Benson, can I just take you back to that question you parked about the impact of identity and what you've learned speaking to many young people around the country as to how it affects their experience of living, all of the things we're describing?
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of dissatisfaction that exists in our young people. And the people that we've been fortunate enough to meet is that, we look at our parents' generation and, they're owning homes, and I don't want the conversation just to go around kind of home ownership because, anyway, it's a choice. It's a choice to own a home. But I look at these young people and they look at and they see their parents who are fortunate to own homes that have been working in the same job for maybe 10 years, 20 years, and there's suddenly a big question mark that's or even a haze over the next steps for a young person. And unfortunately, and I think it does start with education, where we've created a system that's channeling young people into a very limited view of what the future can really hold. And so we're pushing people into a university which, by the third year, the first and second years of an undergrad become irrelevant. When we're channeling people into a workforce that's not really reflective of young people's drivers or passions or the way that they want to work. And so we're seeing young people that are just going, well, what am I really doing? Am I just going through the motions to satisfy something, to satisfy someone? Or can I actually be a determinant in my own future? And for me, I dropped out of uni 6 months in. I really didn't enjoy it. I grew up in Tamworth, and which is it's a relatively small town except for the Country Music Festival, which I highly recommend to everyone. And moved to Sydney, and at 17 years old, and I decided to dive into work because that's if I didn't enjoy university, that was the only other option, right? And then I was fortunate enough to see opportunities. But the thing that I was fortunate enough to have as a young person growing up, and the thing that I'm seeing lacking in a lot of young people that I'm meeting along the way is actually this element of it's the kind of entrepreneurship or this underlying kind of element of drive or passion to do something, to be something and to achieve something. And so we're channeling young people into this predetermined future for themselves. We're predetermining it for them and really not allowing or teaching skills around life. You don't go to school to learn how to do a tax return at all. No, you go to school to learn about Socrates or Plato. But how is that really relevant? Yes, it is. It is very relevant in regards to developing character and morals and drivers for people's lives in a bigger picture. But how is that really practical to Sarah, who's sitting in one of the schools up in Shepparton? Right?
Well, we've got some young people from a particular Anglican school, and they might have some comments to make, and we come through to open that discussion up as to that vision. But I'm interested in, is Australia, as many people here would think, a society where in every generation you can pursue opportunity and not be defined by, if you come from a position of some disadvantage, by that disadvantage? Is it more like that, do you think, or are people being more defined about their future from their origins and the kind of experiences that they grow up in?
I think the institutions that used to shape these, our sense of identity, have become frayed. The church isn't what it used to be. School's not what it used to be. Even universities have changed quite a lot. So in terms of those things that used to give you quite clear parameters and a framework in which to hang what your own aspirations are, who you belong to, all that sort of stuff. It's a lot of that is in flux. So I'm seeing that young people are certainly making their own choices, and they don't have to make the same choices that their parents have made. So I suppose I see future generations being a bit more liberated in that respect. But at the same time, that does pose challenges in terms of, for me, it was, I grew up Catholic, I grew up in the Philippines, and those aspects, define who I am. But for young people today who might, have several ancestries or have different, interest groups that they are part of, I wonder whether that actually makes for richer and more multidimensional sort of identities. You don't have to be the one thing. In fact, each one of you sitting in this audience, you're actually 5, 6 different things simultaneously, and that's okay. But I think young people might be a lot more conscious of that in terms of their allegiances, in terms of their interests. They are actually they're living it. That simultaneity. Being simultaneously a young person, a second generation, migrant or a Sudanese Australian or whatever, an outer Western, a Westie, or a football player, or in all these dimensions, and I think it's actually, that's one positive, I think, in terms of the young people that are living in this time, that they can actually pursue who they want to be without fear or sort of anxiety about whether their parents will hold them back. I think I'm not sure. That's just the sense that I'm getting.
I'd like to say that we aren't. I use the term pigeonholing, because if you're growing up and you're Aboriginal and quite and doing well, you're kind of known as the kind of the black shiny thing that you kind of sit on the mantelpiece and people go, oh wow, isn't he great? But what they forget is actually about the hard work that kind of goes into being here to sit here and to do the stuff at the UN. And I'd like to say that people aren't necessarily pigeonholed, but unfortunately this happens all the time. We exist in bubbles, and the way that we kind of understand people that don't exist in our bubble is to kind of connect them to maybe their past or their ethnicity or their religion, and so this does happen. And I've been thinking a lot lately around this idea of kind of existing in bubbles and how when I say bubbles, I kind of think about, it's a very kind of catch word. It's I think about how our immediate surroundings or our immediate networks, and in the work that we've been doing around engaging young Aboriginal kids, there's a whole spectrum. There's no single person, or there's no single view of an Aboriginal person, but trying to engage the people that sit outside of the people that we use the same language as us. In regards to, when I think about social action, there's a lot of catchphrases that we use, like innovation is one, change maker is another, social action in itself is another catchphrase, and if we just engage the people that use the same language as us, we're constantly missing out on the ideas of people that are just doing really good stuff, that don't call themselves a change maker. They just do it because they care about it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when we start pigeonholing and thinking about people in terms of advantaged or disadvantaged or engaged or disengaged, we actually miss out on the nuances of what makes us all human. And so the one way that we were trying to cut through that is actually focusing on people's values. And the thing that I love about values is they're universal and timeless. So right now we're sitting on Wurundjeri land, right next to Birong Ma. And there's stories here, and there's songs here, and there's dances here that talk about these same values that exist where I grew up in Tamafong Gomeroi land, or Noongar, or Larrakia up in Darwin. And there's these underlying values that are in us all. And the way to cut through like pigeonholing or the way to cut through labels that we give people is actually look at the values that we live by, because values are not tied to educational outcomes or academic outcomes or anything else. They're actually tied to the way that we act and the way that we engage. And if you can tap into people's values, you can't tell another person what their values is, but you can see through their own actions. That's how you can actually cut through and get through that, the rubbish of labels and pigeonholing.
Because I guess, in uncertain times, changing times, many people over many generations have found faith, religion, Christian faith to be, in a way, a transcendent anchor into identity and value and values. And I'd be interested in the sense of how you observe how people believe today. I mean, Benson, your family, your parents have been missionaries and father's a pastor. You worked, Fatima, in the pastoral ministry amongst young Catholic kids. I mean, how is believing, especially amongst Christian people, you perceive differently experienced or live today?
I think there's a broader conversation around separating religion from faith. There's with our young people that they don't necessarily, what I'm seeing a lot of is they're not necessarily subscribing to the institution of religion, but at the same time they feel that they're not losing this strong part of their faith. A faith in something bigger than themselves and something something bolder, something that's created the world that we see around us. And for me, I subscribe to that. So I am Christian, and my father's a minister, and I was raised in the church. And when I was 17, before I left home, about 15. It was at 15. Father and mum took us aside and said, you can make the choice. You can stay within the church and come to church every Sunday and maintain practicing, or you can walk away, and that's fine. And he said that's okay. But myself, my older brother and older sister, we chose to stay within the church until we left home. And then for a long time afterwards, I'd actually walked away from the church because I saw there was a certain level of hypocrisy, a large level of hypocrisy that existed in regards to the way that we acted. In regards to the way that the church has acted. When we look at the Christian lobby up on the hill up in Canberra, which is very extremely conservative, and it didn't necessarily reflect myself as a Christian, where I'm very supportive of same-sex attracted marriage, where I feel that we should be doing so much more. We should be an altruistic society, and yes, that is the view of the Christian lobby as well. But there's a lot of people that are looking at the church and saying, well, actually, you're planted in an archaic age, and while we're existing here, and this discussion around morals and values change. Actually, no, I don't think they actually do. It's actually how we reflect them in our society today, and for us to actually look at what are the current values that are driving people away from the church or away from the institution of religion to just subscribe to this idea of faith, then we need to actually look at how society is made up. We need to look at the role that media plays, the role of separating this idea of character and personality, in which we just value personality rather than actually what makes a person a person. When we're looking at, well, what kind of things are we encouraging our young people to read and to look at when we we see magazines like Clio and Dolly and all this other rubbish, but this is the thing this is the media that is being consumed at the moment. So we need to look at the way that we actually, I guess, create awareness within young people to be able to pull apart what they're seeing or taking away from this world.
Yeah. Fatima, what's your take on believing and how faith is received amongst people of a younger generation?
My sense is that at least post-school age, I think there's greater, how do I put this? Because those supports have fallen away, I mean, the parish, for example, is no longer, the center of the community in some respects, at least, for a good number of families. I think the young people growing up under these conditions are sort of finding their way through faith or religion. And I think that they're engaging with it more critically. And I think that's actually a good thing, because then it's not just something that has been passed down to them that then they regurgitate and they sort of mirror these practices. They actually kind of think about, they actually more, I think that's the sense I get, that they think more and reflect more about what faith means and what it means to live faith, to sort of, and I think some of that search for authenticity finds expression in some of the things that young people are involved in these days. So there's a good component of the campaign for marriage equality that is actually composed of young people. There's any number of social movements today where you find a good number of young people, probably more young people turn up in these campaigns and movements than turn up in church. So, that says something about, how young people are trying to find meaning in their lives and authenticity as well, even if they might, have moved away from the language and the customs and traditions that we sort of put under religion or faith. They're actually living it. And maybe in a sense, the church still has something to say, I have to say. The church still has something to say, and I think whether or not young people growing up within, in religious households take that on, how do I say, take that on, uncritically. I don't know. I suppose I see hope in.
When I talk to people who work with young people who come to faith, often it is authenticity that is a really high value, as you're saying. And people will often reflect back that people will say, well, the attractive thing about joining this church community or this Christian community is that people perceive that we're living Christian faith authentically.
Yeah. And they see communities that are engaged in social issues as being more authentic. And this is, young people are far more exposed today to some of the injustices around the world and even in Australia. They have access to so much information, when I was growing up, all the information that I would get is from the television, from news reports, and then later on from newspapers. But young people are plugged in through social media, through grassroots campaigns via Get Up and things like that. So I think that they're finding, even if they're not using the language of faith, they're living those values that Benson was talking about in very, real ways and very concrete ways.
Just one more topic we might have a chance to speak about a little before we open up to interaction with people who are here, is this, to me, a paradox between the relative disengagement in politics. I think there's a very large number of young people between 18 and 25 who don't vote, who aren't part of the electoral process, but then this other paradox of a high engagement of young people in social movements. And, we've seen a lot of young people even gathered here on Friday when there was some social media that brought people together to talk about the border force announcement or misannouncement, however it's construed. So what do you both make sense of that, apparent, one way looks like disengagement, but in another way, a high engagement with issues of politics.
Yeah, well, you're very right around the disconnect or the disengagement in the political process. So in 2013, at the election in 2013, there was over 400,000 young people aged 18 to 25 that didn't vote, that didn't register, that didn't vote. And unfortunately, these are people that have now been impacted by policy but didn't have any input in that. And we are seeing an increase in people joining social action movements like wonderful Oak Tree Foundation or the AYCC, which is the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. And I think it comes back down to people want to see action. We're getting people out here in Fed Square may not achieve much in a bigger, broader picture, but people feel like they're actually doing something, being able to contribute to something. When you cast your ballot and then you see that the politicians, you might be passionate. Say if you're passionate about climate change, and I won't say which party, but say if you're voting for a particular party, and then you look at the current policies that we have in regards to our climate approach to climate change, where we see that our politicians are influenced greatly, not by the votes of the people, but by the money from the Minerals Corporation of Australia or whichever large mining industries, mining companies that are out there, and others as well, sorry. That where young people are really feeling disenfranchised by the sense of power that they feel that they can actually have as a citizen in their own country. How can anyone feel empowered when you've cast your vote, and then all the debate happens, and then you turn on your TV and you watch Question Time, and then you just see our politicians just screaming at each other across the aisle. Now, there's nothing, absolutely nothing that's impactful or inspiring when you see that kind of action by our nation's leaders. And when we're seeing our leaders that are just completely frozen from taking any real action against the real issues that are going to be impacting our society, not terrorism. Let's think about climate justice. Let's think about refugees and asylum seekers. We need to actually think about what are the real impacts that are happening in our Australian society, and the reasons why young people are feeling disenfranchised and disengaging is because our leaders are not reflecting our communities.
And Fatima, a quick response.
Yeah, I mean that's true. Political allegiance among young people is pretty low. There's quite a significant number who weren't even enrolled to vote at the last election. And I agree with what Benson was saying. We've been talking about insecurity and uncertainty, and young people, they're pretty sharp. They're pretty cluey, and they see their government isn't acting in their interests. So why should they? So we're talking about political allegiance. If governments from either side of politics haven't shown any commitment to their future, why should they commit? Why should they show political allegiance as well? Why should they, plug into these politicians? They're actually quite partisan too, and not really like Benson was saying, acting in their interest. I mean, if you break it down, a young African Australian looking at the rhetoric, or a young Aboriginal Australian looking at the rhetoric, or even a young gay person looking at the rhetoric. I mean, it's all very alienating, actually. So I can completely understand that young people are making their own choices and putting their energy and commitment to something that they feel reflects their values more, as Benson has been saying.
I'm Anne-Marie Power, and I'm finding this very inspiring, as all the talks are that Archbishop organises for us. But I'm particularly interested in what both of you say in regard to the relevance of education for young people nowadays. I think a lot of us are very concerned about that as to how meaningful it is for their future. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions of how it might be made more relevant for their future, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. An elaboration of that question is, what would you actually, what did you actually teach young people in secondary school? What subjects would you get them to do? or even in primary school, what would you change? And I was really incredibly interested in your remark about people dropping out of university and leaving at second year. My understanding is the dropout in first year universities has always been high for, for 40, 50 years. It's just an established stat, for whatever reason. So it's not all that new. Anyhow, let's focus on that education.
Yes, Stump. When I grew up, people would ask you, what are you going to do? You knew what you were going to do. You knew you would get into a course. You knew you would get a job. I don't think I ever did a job interview. I just wandered along and said, OK, I'll start tomorrow if you like. I wouldn't know how to do a job interview. And I think kids now, they can be defeated by one wretched point in an exam result. Nothing to do with the aptitude of the student. Medicine is the preferred thing this year. It'll be something else next year. How can they even build when there's no certainty at all of their future out of school?
I think that it's really good points, and I might I'll come to you second. But was there? I guess one of the biggest issues that we're seeing currently is what I feel is one of the biggest issues, and obviously it must be if we have three people kind of standing up and asking a question around this. Is we're teaching to a test, where you're right. A person's future can be determined. Unfortunately, feels like it determined by the UA. We call it ATAR here. The ATAR score, and a little secret. So my UA, we had URLs in no, that's definitely to do with the internet. I am a young person. Okay, no, okay. So the HSC, that's what it was called. My score was actually so low that if I was over the age of 18, I could have taken my pink slip up to the local pub called the Imperial and got a free schooner. And for me, when I think about that, is I loved school. I didn't like it academically. I enjoyed it because it was it was social and it was challenging in different ways. And when I think about the challenges that we're facing in our education system, is that we have people that are that are smart, that are engaging, and that are being funneled through a rigid system to say, all right, you need to show your abilities in a 60-minute test, and half of those will be, your answers will be determined out of multiple choice. For me, that's no way to actually understand someone's, I guess, ability to succeed, or ability to learn or educate, and so I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And if I had the option if I could teach anything within schools, the one thing that I really love is this element of curiosity. I think curiosity is this beautiful thing where it asks someone it gets someone to ask a question around how or why. A curious mind is someone who's a tinkerer or a tailor. It's someone who can work in ambiguity and make something of it. And unfortunately, when we're teaching to a test, there's no room for ambiguity. There's no room for tinkering. There's no room for just trying and failing and picking yourself up and trying again. There's no room for that in our current education system. And if I could change anything, it would be the way in which our students are encouraged to be curious.
Yeah. Thanks for those questions. I mean, clearly education is something that we're concerned about. I was a secondary school teacher in the outer west suburbs of Melbourne, and I agree that we're still stuck with a factory model of education. Where you get an assembly line of students that we spit out at the end and hope for the best. So I think there are some shifts, there are inquiry-based practices that are in schools now. But I think there are still some fundamentals that will never change. I understand a bit about experimentation and taking risks and exploring and all that sort of stuff. But there are some fundamental things like maths, that are still need to be in place. Language is still quite fundamental because language is basically it's the unit of thinking. I was an English teacher, and I used to tell my students, the quality of your essay has to do with the quality of your thinking. If you can think well, then you should be able to write well, and those two actually go together. Language and thinking go together. So numeracy and literacy are fundamental. I think what probably needs to change is the pedagogy, perhaps. But the other thing that I would say, there was a question about, well, what should be in the curriculum? I think there needs to be greater emphasis on science. Like, I grew up with a fantastic, I had a fantastic science curriculum throughout my school years, and I had fantastic science teachers. And I think that's really important these days. You've got, the anti-vaccination movement, anti-climate science, anti-GMOs, and there's a lot of, I think people become vulnerable to these things if they don't have that sense that, there's a process to science, there are methods to science, And I suppose the other thing that I would add is, that I take from my schooling as well, is just engaging with where we are in the world. Like, we're in Asia, we're in the Asia Pacific. But I think beyond Indonesia, few people could probably point where Singapore is or where, South Korea is on a map. And I think that needs to really radically, change. We need to change that. And because these are the young people that will be, that are living in a highly globalized, mobile world. And as we've got looking at our immigration patterns as well. There are opportunities there for Australia to engage with the world through these young people. So I think those are some of the things that I think needs to be emphasised quite a lot more.
And I think there's this. We've actually in a very short period of our history defined education as a kind of an institutional thing that you're either in it or you're out of it. And I think if you sort of projected forward, countries that can turn ideas into commercial application, have a high degree of innovation, they certainly have the university sector, a very highly integrated university research sector and commercial development sector. So I think that if you bring that back to earlier years of schooling, I think there should be more seamlessness where you can acquire the knowledge that you need and you can enter and gain that. Whereas I think that we have a sense that if you sort of drop out of school, it's sort of like you're in the boat one moment, but then sometimes you're out just floating around in a life ring and there's lots of sharks in the water. And I think we've kind of, in a way, we were saying earlier that institutions like institutionalised religion, the church, are critiqued, but we've actually not probably critiqued the institutional character of education and the boundaries that once you fall out of it probably make it pretty hard to go back in. I think, to me, we really need to have a lot of pathways and encourage people to believe that a score, some test, some achievement isn't the limit. It just tells you something on the way through, but really create lots of pathways for the kind of economy that we have. Not for an old economy or something else, but for things we have. So I think that there's much we could really do about having coherent educational policy in that way.
We can scrap NAPLAN. Controversial.
I think you're also, I guess, alluding to just being able to teach the love of learning as well. Because if you love the idea of learning and growing your own knowledge, then there is no boundaries. If you're in the education system or outside the education system, it's kind of it's just language rather than actually the love of learning is actually about living life.
Hello, good morning. My name's Ishra and I'm from Yarra Valley Grammar and I'm 15 years old. So I'm currently in Year 9 and I'm about to go into VCE, which presents the future and the scary kind of big world out there. And my question was, how do you think a person of my age, so 15 years old, could best contribute to the community? And what advice would you give us as people who may not have as much influence as our youth? What's like a piece of a tool to give us to kind of have our impact, and also what would we do as people of our age? Thank you.
My name's Howard Hutchins. I come off the slum streets of Fitzroy and Collingwood. I have employed over 20 apprentices, and I have never heard such rubbish. My question is, when are you going to get people into the real world? This young bloke paints, you'll excuse the pun, a black picture. Thank God she's an ex-school teacher, because
Can we just keep
nothing
the
of the
tone
real world.
respectful,
The real world.
please?
When are you going to get into the real world?
My question's more about cost of living. You mentioned that it's difficult for people to purchase a house or to raise the deposit required. When I was growing up, and I'm a civil engineer, my big purchase was a slide rule, and it's now an antique piece. But young people these days need a mobile phone, connection to the internet. They need at least one device, if not more. And so is there an underlying cost of living today which then makes it more difficult for people to enter into big bulk purchases like the cost of a home? If you add to that what's happened in society today, so marriages are failing at more than 50%, and a lot of those are in the first 10 years of marriage, so there is an additional cost when you've got families divided, and there's two costs, if you like, of living, particularly where there are children involved. So is the cost in our society and probably poor financial management of people just trying to live and compete, is that one of the underlying issues for unaffordability of housing and the goals that they might otherwise want to achieve?
Can I just say that I don't think that Benson has a black perspective on anything. He's an Australian.
I don't know. I think he was saying that it was a very gloomy outlook, more so than
just going back to your.
I think that listening to the other in society is one of the greatest challenges we all face. And even though it's sometimes difficult, it's very important to respectfully do that. I would have been quite interested to hear a little bit more about that perspective, because it is a real view in society, and we need to respect the generations that have lived through difficult times. The Depression was a very challenging time. Of course, there wasn't the challenge of climate change and other uncertainties that face young people today. But there was huge unemployment, people were knocking on doors for meals and so on. What was it that got people through so that there wasn't the suicide rate that we see today, and which is so tragic? I think this has been a wonderful discussion because it's raised so many issues. Education, we tend to pigeonhole. I relate to Benson's comment about pigeonholing. And education doesn't come from just going to a good school. It's the home. It's hearing from so many quarters, great stories that can inspire, the importance of a curiosity, learning. All of those things I think we need to be looking at for young people so that they have the resilience, the confidence in themselves to be strong, to persevere, to learn from earlier generations, and to share a community-based confidence in the future despite the challenges. Sorry, that's a long comment, but I was quite upset by the way that comment was dismissed earlier.
In terms of how young people can contribute, I think the first things you need to figure out is what matters to you, like what really gets in your gut, and only you can answer that. And what are you good at? What are the things? What are your skills? What are the things that are easy for you to do? In terms of actually contributing now, I mean, your school probably is doing some of those things already. You can participate in that. Or if you're part of a parish community, you can participate in that as well. I think, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. I mean, there are already good people doing good work that you can add your energy to. But the important thing for you is to actually do well at school. Like, excel at school. and get the most out of it that you can now, so that when you do leave school, you've got the resources and the skills and the critical thinking capacity to be able to make a difference later on.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree with that. One thing that popped to mind as you're asking that is there's a wonderful quote by Pericles, and he says, "What we leave behind is not what's carved into stone monuments, but what's woven in the hearts of others." And for me, I think there's no earlier time to start at actually being able to weave your life or weave your story into other people's lives as well. And so there's wonderful organisations that exist out there to engage young people, like UN Youth Australia, the AYCC, which I mentioned earlier, Oak Tree Foundation, which are looking at some of the issues that are impacting right across the world. So things around alleviating poverty, the challenges of climate change now and into the future, amongst other things. So I would really encourage you to just have a look online and see what different organisations are out there that connect to your values, that connect to your passions, and to involve yourselves in those organisations. Because there's something really special when you bring like-minded people together. You can achieve amazing things. And when you're 15 years old and you're thinking about what the future holds, there's nothing more important than actually having a strong purpose in life as well. And so if you can tap into that and understand that and surround yourself with people that share a common passion or a similar purpose to you, that's a good step in the right direction.
I was interested in Howard's comment about giving 20 people, young people, apprenticeships, because I think that we're talking about things here, and it's very easy for us to project onto bigger institutions of society that we don't necessarily have confidence in, expectations. Whereas if we all have a capacity to be active in making life different for people, and I think there's a lot of structural change. Probably the kind of the manufacturing base that maybe Howard you've been part of isn't as open for young Australians as they might have been in an earlier generation. But I think that the fact that as small business owners, as people in neighbourhoods, in different ways, we've actually got a lot of initiative to respond to some of these issues. And if that was your point, Howard, I think that's an important point, and important to celebrate that you can make decisions that actually do materially improve the opportunities of a young person, because one of the defining characteristics of long-term disadvantage is really where people are in this area of participation, either in school or employment, between the ages of 15 and 18. And there's not just Australian, but there's international experience that if you at say the ages between 15 and 18 in a welfare dependency situation, that's a very high predictor of long-term welfare dependence. And a bit what I was saying earlier about the moving, beyond a move, not just dropping out of things, but apprenticeships as they probably once were, which were a really good outcome for people of my generation who were not school-minded at the age of 15 to go into something where they got some life experience, close mentoring of, isn't as open, young people now, and for people who, for whatever reason, don't fit in. I mean, it's a really risky and dangerous time, and I think as a society, we can achieve a lot by having some very targeted intervention to help people participate in those critical years.
That's right. So elements around vocational education and training, so we call it VET for short, which is really critical for people that aren't necessarily achieving academically, that are looking at trades. And so having 20 apprentices, was it? Sorry, can you say that again? I actually think that we have to think about the geopolitical kind of realm in which I think that we have to look at the manufacturing costs that were happening across the world. So we saw the rise in China, and so it was actually cheaper to produce overseas. And so we saw our manufacturing actually bottom out because we were looking at our larger producers that were finding it cheaper to actually produce overseas and import in. Unfortunately, that's what's killed the car industries. Yes, there's been a lot of movement from people to say, you know, this is a dying industry. Unfortunately, it's very negative and stark kind of language to use around people's lives and people's livelihoods and jobs. But there is a greater impact that's actually happening when you know, we're seeing lower prices, where people are living on less than $2 a day overseas that are working shocking manufacturing jobs, when things are being more and more automated overseas to lower the price of actually production to actually come back into Australia. That's when we're seeing the impacts of textiles, we're seeing the impacts of manufacturing, the car industries and other industries like that. They're the ones that are taking the hit. So it's not the left, sir. Unfortunately, it's not, and because it's a very easy target to challenge the left, but there's greater factors and greater forces that are actually at play, and the place to start is actually around looking at international tax systems.
Okay. So thank you to all those who have been part of the conversation this morning. Thank you to our guests, Fatima Measham and Benson Saulo, and to Archbishop Philip.
Perhaps we just close with a prayer, recognising the giftedness that God has amongst us all. Lord God, we recognise you as a source of all human potential. Strengthen the hope of young people in our society that they might encounter the future with courage and optimism. In those things that have been stirred in our own thinking today, help us to take some action, not just to project those things onto others, and help us to recognise the human dignity in each person and look with confidence to young people to lead and shape our society for our future. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So thank you very much for your participation today.